The letter found him the way most things in his life did: late, unceremonious, and without any sense of occasion. It had been forwarded twice before reaching his current address, a rented room above a closed-down bait shop near the edge of town. The envelope was creased, its corners softened by travel and indifference. Official, cream-colored. His name typed cleanly across the front, as if whoever sent it believed that name still meant something solid. He opened it standing by the window, one thumb hooked in his jacket pocket, the other tearing the seal with a practiced lack of curiosity. The words were plain enough. Legal language. Property transfer. Deceased estate. A remote mountain cabin, sole beneficiary. His grandfather's cabin. He read it twice, not because he didn't understand, but because he was waiting for a feeling to arrive and explain what the moment was supposed to mean. Nothing came. No shock. No anger. No relief. Just a thin, hollow quiet, like a room after the furniture's been moved out, but before anyone admits it's empty. He sat on the edge of the bed and let the paper rest in his hands. His grandfather had been a rumor more than a presence. A man who sent no birthday cards, made no phone calls, and occupied no space in family stories except as a vague example of how stubbornness could outlive affection. They had met twice, maybe 3 times, always in town, never at the cabin. Always brief. Always polite in the way strangers are when they share blood but not memory. The inheritance itself didn't surprise him. No one else would have wanted it. What surprised him was how little he cared. Or rather, how practiced he had become at not caring. Drifting had a way of sanding down emotional edges. Years of short-term jobs, warehouse shifts, seasonal labor, repair work done cheap and quiet. Years of temporary addresses, borrowed furniture, mattresses that never quite felt clean. He had learned not to anchor himself to things that could be taken away with 30 days' notice. Ownership was a language he had never spoken fluently. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of old paper and lemon cleaner. The man behind the desk was younger than expected, sleeves rolled just enough to suggest approachability, fingers constantly adjusting the knot of his tie. "It's remote," the lawyer said, tapping the folder. "Very remote. No municipal water. No modern electrical updates. No inspections on record for decades." He looked up, measuring the reaction. Maintenance alone could exceed the property's value. Selling might be the more practical option. Practical. The word slid easily into the air, like it belonged there. He stared past the desk at a framed photograph of a mountain ridge, snow caught in its folds like white scars. It was generic enough to mean nothing, which somehow made it worse. "I'll see it first," he said. The lawyer paused. "You don't have to. We can handle." "I'll see it first," he repeated, voice steady but final. He signed the papers without ceremony. His name looked strange at the bottom of the page, too deliberate for a life that had mostly happened by default. The drive into the mountains began as an afterthought and slowly became a commitment. The road narrowed, asphalt giving way to patched pavement, then gravel. Switchbacks stacked on top of one another like a question no one expected answered quickly. The air thinned as he climbed, pressing against his ears, sharpening the quiet until it felt deliberate. Beside him, his dog lay sprawled across the passenger seat, chin resting against the window. The animal's coat was a rough blend of gray and black, weathered in a way that spoke of time spent outdoors without complaint. One ear tipped slightly forward, the other relaxed. His eyes tracked movement more than scenery. They had found each other 3 winters earlier. A half-frozen night. A torn paw. A growl that faded into exhaustion halfway through. He had paid the vet in installments and never thought to ask if the dog belonged to someone else. Some things arrived already decided. Since then, the dog had followed him through every move, every place that didn't last. The one constant in a life built on expiration dates. The forest thickened as the road climbed. Pine and fir crowded close, their branches knitting overhead in places, blocking the sky. Snow lingered in the shadows, thin and stubborn. There were no signs now. No mile markers. No cell signal. The silence changed up here. It wasn't empty. It was alert. When the road curved sharply one last time, and the trees pulled back, the cabin appeared without announcement. It sat in a small clearing, its roof slumped under the weight of years, shingles darkened by weather and neglect. The porch sagged at the center, boards bleached silver by sun and snow. No smoke rose from the chimney. No tracks marked the ground. It looked abandoned. and somehow it didn't. There was a patience to it, a stillness that felt less like neglect and more like waiting, as if the structure had been holding its breath, not expecting rescue, but not ruling it out either. He cut the engine. The sudden quiet rang in his ears. The dog hopped down first, paws crunching softly on gravel. He sniffed the air, tail moving low and slow, not wagging, not stiff. Curious, cautious, evaluating. He stood there for a moment longer, keys still in his hand, and let the place settle around him. Wind moved through the trees with a thin whistle. Somewhere farther down the slope, water murmured over rock. No engines, no voices, no borrowed noise bleeding through walls. He realized then how tired he was of other people's sounds. The front door resisted when he tried it, swollen in its frame. He leaned into it, shoulder first, muttering under his breath. The wood gave with a reluctant creak, like it hadn't decided yet whether to allow this. Dust rose in a pale cloud, catching the light slanting through the porch windows. The smell was old wood, cold iron, and something faintly herbal, long dried and forgotten. He stepped inside. The room was spare. A table, chairs mismatched but sturdy, a narrow shelf of sun-faded books, a wood stove crouched beneath a stained hood. Everything useful, nothing indulgent. The dog padded in behind him, nails clicking softly, already mapping the space. He closed the door and slid the key into the lock. It turned with effort, metal grinding against metal that hadn't moved in years. The sound echoed louder than it should have. For the first time since the letter arrived, something shifted in his chest. Not warmth, not excitement, but awareness. A recognition that this place, for better or worse, was no longer a possibility. It was his. He rested his forehead briefly against the door, feeling the grain of the wood, the weight of it holding firm. He had never owned anything that stayed. Outside, the mountain stood silent and unmoved, as if listening. Inside, the lock clicked fully into place. And the cabin, after all this time, was no longer waiting. Morning arrived slowly, as if the mountain needed time to decide whether it would allow the day to begin. The man woke to cold seeping through the floorboards and the quiet weight of being somewhere that did not belong to anyone else. No traffic, no voices through thin walls. Just the soft creak of wood responding to temperature and the steady, familiar rise and fall of his dogs breathing nearby. Dust motes floated in the pale light slipping through the single window, drifting like they had nowhere urgent to be. He sat up on the mattress he'd unrolled the night before, rubbed his face, and listened. The silence here wasn't absence. It had texture, depth. It waited back when spoken to. He stood, pulled on his jacket, and began with the windows. Each one fought him, latches stiff with rust, frames swollen from years of weather. When they finally opened, the air rushed in sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine, snowmelt, and damp earth. The room changed immediately. Dust lifted and moved, stirred into motion by something alive. He opened them all. The cabin revealed itself slowly, the way honest things often do. The furnishings were sparse and practical. A table built from thick planks, its surface scarred by knives and years of use. Chairs that didn't match but shared the same patient sturdiness. Shelves that bowed slightly under the weight of old books whose spines had cracked not from neglect, but from being read and reread. Nothing here pretended to be more than it was. He found kindling stacked neatly near the stove, dry despite the years. His grandfather's hand, he realized. The man had prepared for winter even when there was no one left to share it with. The fire caught after some coaxing, flames licking upward with a cautious hunger. Warmth crept into the room, softening the edges of the cold. His dog stretched, stood, and repositioned himself closer to the stove, eyes half-lidded in approval. The man leaned against the counter and let the heat soak into his bones. He hadn't felt rooted in a place since childhood, and even then, the memory was thin. His early years were a series of moves dictated by other people's failures and attempts at repair. Apartments that changed faster than seasons. Schools where he learned not to unpack too quickly. Adults who spoke in hushed voices about money and what would happen if things didn't improve. His grandfather had existed in those years only as a shadow at the edge of conversation. A name dropped when arguments stalled. A stubborn man. A mountain man. Someone who had chosen isolation over compromise. He had never been invited to the cabin. The kitchen revealed its age without apology. An enamel sink chipped and worn. cabinets whose doors hung slightly crooked. He turned the faucet and was rewarded only with a dry, hollow rattle. He crouched and traced the water lines with his eyes, following their path into the crawlspace. Rust bloomed along the joints like old scars. One pipe lay split clean open, the metal torn by freeze and time. Figures, he muttered. There was no landlord to call now. No maintenance request to submit. The realization settled into him with unexpected calm. He could leave, lock the door, drive back down the mountain, and tell the lawyer the place was too much trouble. No one would blame him. That had been the pattern his whole life. Step away before things asked too much. Instead, he grabbed a flashlight and went to work. The cabin had been built by hand. That much was clear. Beams thicker than modern codes required. Nails driven with force rather than precision. The structure was solid but old, like someone who had survived by being stubborn rather than adaptable. He made a mental list. Water lines, insulation, roof inspection. It was a long list, and instead of feeling overwhelmed, he felt steady. Work, he realized, had always been his anchor. Not the kind that paid well or earned praise, but the kind that required presence. Hands, attention, honest effort. Renovation wasn't escape. It was engagement. By midday, sweat dampened his collar despite the cold. He peeled off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and stood back to look at the main room. Something about the layout bothered him. A narrow interior wall cut the space in two, separating the sitting area from a cramped alcove barely large enough for a cot. It didn't feel necessary. He stepped into the alcove. The air was stale, heavier here, as if it didn't circulate properly. A small window faced north, letting in little light. He imagined the room gone. The space opened, sunlight stretching clean from one end of the cabin to the other. Clarity. His dog followed, sniffing along the baseboards, tail low but relaxed. When the man reached for the crowbar, the dog paused, watching with quiet interest. The first board came away with a protest of old nails and dust. The sound echoed sharply in the small space. He coughed, waved the air clear, and continued. Board by board, the wall surrendered. The work was physical and immediate. Muscles burned. Breath deepened. Sweat traced familiar paths down his spine. Each piece removed widened the room, let more light spill across the floor. The dog retreated to a sunlit patch near the door, content to supervise from a safe distance. When the last board fell, the room felt transformed. Bigger, lighter, more honest. He leaned against the crowbar, chest rising and falling, and allowed himself a small, private satisfaction. Then he noticed what remained. A narrow vertical section of wall stood untouched, about 3 feet wide, running from floor to ceiling. The wood was darker than the surrounding planks, less weathered by light. He frowned. Structurally, it made no sense. The beams overhead were supported elsewhere. There was no visible reason for this strip to exist. "Why'd you leave this?" he murmured, unsure who he was asking. The dog, who had been dozing, lifted his head. He stood and approached the remaining section, nose working. His posture changed subtly. Tail stilled, ears angled forward. The man tapped the wood lightly with the hammer. The sound was wrong. Not hollow. Not solid like a beam. Muted. Dense. He tapped again, harder. Same response. Like striking something that didn't want to answer. The dog let out a low, uncertain sound, somewhere between a whine and a warning. The man felt a prickle climb his spine. He pressed his palm against the wood. It was colder here. He stepped back and studied it again. The edges were too clean. The boards around it too carefully fitted. This wasn't a mistake. Whatever lay behind it had been hidden deliberately. The room seemed to hold its breath. He lowered the hammer, heart thudding a little louder than before, and stared at the wall as if it might speak first. Something about this place, he realized, had not been meant to be found all at once. And he had only just begun to listen. The house felt different once he knew something was wrong. Not louder, not darker, just aware. As if the cabin had shifted from being a passive structure into something that watched him move through it, measuring his choices. He circled the remaining strip of wall slowly, flashlight beam tracing the seams. The wood had been planed smooth, its grain running vertical, unlike the rest of the cabin's interior. Someone had taken care here. Not the careless efficiency of construction, but the deliberate patience of concealment. This wasn't here by accident, he said aloud, testing the sound of his voice in the space. His dog didn't answer. He stood several feet back now, body angled away from the wall, eyes fixed on it. The fur along his shoulders had lifted, not fully raised, but unsettled. A memory without a picture, triggered by scent alone. The man slid the crowbar into the narrow seam where the darker planks met the lighter boards around them. The metal teeth bit. He leaned his weight forward. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the board cracked with a sharp report, splitting down the grain like dry bone. Dust burst outward, stinging his eyes and filling his mouth with the taste of old wood and neglect. He coughed, blinked hard, and pried again. The second board came loose easier, nails tearing free with a metallic shriek. Behind it was not the expected lattice of studs and insulation, but something dark and solid. Metal. He froze, crowbar hanging loosely from his hand. The dog took another step back, nails scraping softly on the floor. He let out a low, warning sound that the man hadn't heard since the night they'd found each other in the snow. "It's okay," the man said, though he wasn't sure who he was trying to convince. He brushed away the splintered wood and dust with gloved hands, revealing more of the surface beneath. A flat plane of iron stretched from floor to ceiling, its surface rough with age, rust blooming in slow, patient patterns. This was no reinforcement plate, no structural brace. This was a door. The edges were set tight against the surrounding frame, so perfectly aligned that it had disappeared entirely behind the wall. A seam ran vertically down the center, so fine it vanished unless the light hit it just right. At chest height, a handle jutted outward, a thick iron bar, curved slightly, orange with rust but still whole. Below it hung the remains of a padlock, its shackle cut clean through, the metal ends rounded by time. Someone had locked this once. Someone else had made sure it would never be locked again. The man's stomach tightened. He stepped back and took in the full shape of it, the impossible geometry of an iron door hidden inside a wooden cabin built nearly a century earlier. This wasn't paranoia or eccentricity. This was intention. His dog pressed himself against the far wall now, ears flat, eyes never leaving the door. His breathing had changed, shorter, faster. He could smell something the man could not, something that reached back into instinct and memory. "What did you find, old man?" the man murmured, half to himself, half to the absent figure of his grandfather. The question hung unanswered. He could stop. That thought arrived fully formed, reasonable and tempting. He could nail the boards back in place, seal the wall, and pretend this was nothing more than an abandoned project. Call the lawyer. Tell him the cabin was unsuitable. Walk away. It would be familiar. Safe. His hand closed around the handle of the crowbar, then loosened. Running had never erased the things he left behind. It only relocated them, gave them new names and sharper edges. He reached out and touched the iron. Cold bit through the leather of his glove instantly, a deep, invasive chill that crawled into his palm and up his arm. The metal felt wrong, not just cold, but old in a way that went beyond age, like something that had been kept in the dark on purpose. He traced the surface with his fingers, feeling shallow grooves carved into the iron, patterns worn soft by time, circles intersecting with lines at odd angles, no longer clear enough to read, but deliberate enough to unsettle. Industrial, maybe, or something else. The cut padlock told him this door had been opened before. Not gently, not recently. He wrapped both hands around the handle and pulled. Nothing. The iron didn't shift, didn't creak, didn't acknowledge the effort at all. His muscles tensed, shoulders straining. Rust grated under his grip, flaking onto the floor. Behind him, the dog growled, a low, steady sound that vibrated through his chest. "Easy," the man whispered. He set his feet wider, braced himself, and pulled again. This time, the mountain answered. The lower hinge gave with a deep, grinding groan that rolled through the cabin like distant thunder. Dust sifted down from the ceiling. The seam between the two halves of the door widened by a hair. Air rushed out. Not the stale breath of a forgotten room, but something colder, heavier. It carried a sharp metallic tang, undercut by a bitter chemical note that made his throat tighten. The dog snarled softly, taking another step back, but he did not flee. He held his ground, muscles coiled. The man swallowed and pulled again. The hinge screamed now, a sound so raw and tortured it set his teeth on edge. The door moved inch by inch, resisting every effort, as if the mountain itself were reluctant to let go. Then, with a final protest, it opened enough for a person to slip through. Beyond it yawned a narrow corridor. Concrete walls stretched into darkness, smooth and unadorned, nothing like the hand-built warmth of the cabin above. Pipes ran along one side, wrapped in cracked insulation. Thick cables disappeared into the gloom, vanishing as if swallowed by the mountain. The cold pouring from the corridor was immediate and invasive, far colder than the air outside. It smelled of metal, oil, and something faintly chemical, manufactured, controlled, unnatural. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling several feet in, its glass clouded with dust. It did not flicker. It did not glow. It waited. The man stood at the threshold, heart pounding, every instinct urging caution. This was not an old root cellar, not a storm shelter. This was infrastructure. His dog edged closer, pressing his side against the man's leg, offering silent solidarity. His eyes never left the dark. "Guess we're past pretending now," the man murmured. He stepped inside. The temperature dropped instantly, biting through his clothes. His breath fogged faintly in the beam of his flashlight. The concrete underfoot was solid, dry, and sloped gently downward, guiding him deeper without asking permission. Each step echoed too clearly. The sound swallowed and returned by the narrow walls. At the end of the corridor stood another door. This one was different. Thick steel, bolted directly into the mountain itself. No hinges visible. No handle. Only a circular metal plate set at chest height, worn smooth by countless touches. He approached slowly, the air growing warmer as he neared it, just enough to register as wrong. He raised his hand, hesitated, then pressed his palm to the plate. For the second time that day, metal greeted him with warmth. A click sounded inside the wall. Then another. With a deep, mechanical hum that resonated through the stone, the door slid sideways into the rock, disappearing with deliberate precision. Warm, stale air breathed out from the chamber beyond. The dog growled low, but did not retreat. The man stepped forward, crossing the threshold as the door sealed itself behind him. And whatever his grandfather had buried in the mountain finally stopped waiting. The chamber was larger than he expected. Not a room, exactly, but an installation carved directly into the mountain, its walls a rough marriage of poured concrete and exposed stone. The ceiling arched low in places, higher in others, following the unwilling geometry of the rock it had been forced into. Nothing here had been designed for comfort. It had been built to endure. The door slid shut behind him with a muted finality, sealing away the corridor and the cabin above. The sound pressed against his chest, heavy and undeniable. He swept his flashlight across the space. Metal shelves lined one wall, their surfaces layered with dust. Old binders slumped between rusted brackets, their labels faded to near illegibility. A bank of gauges sat embedded in a steel panel, needles frozen in various positions like insects trapped in amber. Pipes crisscrossed the chamber, some disappearing into the stone, others feeding into a massive structure at the center. The structure stole the air from his lungs. A steel cylinder rose from the floor, bolted directly into the bedrock. Thick as a small car, tall as a man, its surface scarred with age and use. Heavy cables ran from its sides, vanishing into the mountain. Valves and access ports ringed its midsection, their handles worn smooth by hands that had worked them repeatedly, carefully. This wasn't storage. It was containment. He approached slowly, boots echoing against concrete. His dog stayed close, shoulder brushing his leg, body tense. The animal's tail was tucked now, not in fear but in awareness, as if something in the air spoke a language older than thought. A brass plate was bolted above the cylinder, its surface dulled by time, but still readable beneath the beam of his flashlight. Subsurface Pressure Retention Chamber. Project Hollow. Authorized personnel only. Below it, etched in smaller letters. Structural failure may result in ridge collapse. Report any irregularity immediately. His mouth went dry. Project Hollow. The name carried weight, not because it explained anything, but because it didn't. This wasn't a personal endeavor or a private experiment. This was institutional, official, the kind of work that came with budgets, oversight, and consequences. And then, at some point, had been abandoned. He circled the cylinder, flashlight steady despite the pounding of his heart. Most of the gauges were dead, their glass clouded, needles resting at 0 or frozen mid-scale. But one needle twitched slightly when he passed, vibrating just enough to catch his attention. He leaned closer. A thin line of moisture glistened along a weld near the base of the cylinder. Just a bead at first, then another. The droplets slid down the steel and vanished into a narrow channel cut into the floor. His breath caught. This wasn't condensation. The air here was dry, controlled. Whatever was seeping from that weld was under pressure, forced out by something shifting below. He stepped back, pulse roaring in his ears. The mountain wasn't static. It never had been. This system hadn't been built to store something inside the rock. It had been built to hold the rock itself in place. The realization settled slowly, each piece clicking into position with terrible clarity. A fault line, a weak seam in the ridge, pressure building over time, held back by steel and stubborn maintenance. His grandfather hadn't discovered a secret. He'd been assigned one, or inherited it himself. The man felt a sudden, aching understanding for the silence that had surrounded the old man all his life. The distance, the refusal to come down from the mountain. This wasn't isolation for its own sake. It was vigilance. You weren't hiding from people, he murmured into the vast, humming quiet. You were standing guard. His dog whined softly, pacing now, nails clicking anxiously against the concrete. The animal's unease spiked as another faint tremor passed through the floor, so subtle it might have been imagined if not for the way the flashlight beam shivered. The cylinder responded with a dull, internal thud, like something shifting under strain. The man's chest tightened. If this failed, it wouldn't just take the cabin. It would take the ridge, the valley below, roads, homes, lives that had no idea they were balanced on a century-old compromise buried beneath a forgotten cabin. This wasn't his problem, and it was entirely his problem. He pulled his phone from his pocket, hands unsteady, and began documenting everything. Photos of the brass plate, the gauges, the leaking weld, short video clips of the trembling needle, the bead of moisture forming and falling. Evidence, because no one would believe a story like this without proof. His dog pressed close again, whining low in his throat, urging movement. Instinct screamed what logic already knew. This place was not safe. The man took one last look at the cylinder, at the cables vanishing into stone, at the impossible weight of responsibility that had been handed down to him without consent. An inheritance, he thought bitterly, not of land or money, but of consequence. He turned toward the exit. The steel door slid open at his approach, releasing another breath of stale warmth. He didn't look back as he guided his dog through, down the corridor, out of the mountain's throat. The iron door groaned as it closed behind him, sealing the chamber once more. When he emerged into the cabin, the contrast was jarring. Warm wood, firelight, the ordinary smell of pine and smoke. It all felt suddenly fragile. He didn't linger. He grabbed his keys, his jacket, his phone. His dog followed without hesitation, already moving toward the truck as if he understood the urgency, without explanation. Outside, the mountain stood unchanged, serene, indifferent. But the man knew better now. As he drove down the switchbacks, hands tight on the wheel, one thought anchored him against the rising fear. Some truths were too heavy to carry alone, and this one was already starting to crack. The call didn't go through the first time, or the second. The man drove in silence, eyes flicking between the road and the dead bars on his phone, the mountain receding behind him with deceptive calm. The switchbacks felt sharper now, less forgiving. Every creak of the truck made his pulse jump, as if the ground itself might decide it had waited long enough. At the first overlook where the trees thinned, a single bar flickered into existence. He pulled over so hard the gravel sprayed. The connection wavered as he dialed. When the line finally caught, a calm voice answered, practiced and distant. Emergency services. What's the nature of your call? He swallowed, steadied himself, and spoke. There's an underground installation beneath my cabin, he said. A pressure containment system. It's labeled Project Hollow. One of the chambers is leaking. It's bolted into the ridge. Silence stretched, thin and dangerous. Then the voice changed. Sir, I need you to stay on the line. He did. Questions followed. Location, photographs, access points. He answered all of them, hands trembling now that the adrenaline had somewhere to go. He emailed the images while parked on the side of the road, phone balanced on the steering wheel, dog pressed against his leg as if anchoring him to the present. Within an hour, vehicles with unfamiliar markings began to arrive. Geological survey trucks, Emergency response units. Men and women in heavy jackets and boots that had never been new in their lives. No one laughed. No one dismissed him. That, more than anything, confirmed the truth of what he had found. Trailheads were closed by nightfall. Signs went up, bright and unmistakable. Monitoring equipment was installed along the ridge, sensors drilled into rock and soil. The mountain was suddenly under watch, as if it had finally drawn enough attention to justify its quiet threat. He wasn't allowed back up. "You did the right thing," a woman told him, her face windburned and serious. She introduced herself as a field engineer, her handshake firm. "But this isn't your site anymore." He wanted to argue, wanted to insist he belonged there now, that it was his land, his inheritance. The words felt hollow even as they formed. Instead, he nodded and stepped back. Powerlessness settled over him in the days that followed. He stayed in town, sleeping in the truck or cheap rooms, waiting for updates that came in clipped, careful language. He learned just enough to understand how little he truly knew. The chamber was unstable but intact. A failure waiting, not an explosion, but something slower and more insidious. Pressure building over decades. Steel fatigued by time. A system designed to last 50 years that had been forced to endure twice that. Heavy machinery climbed the mountain in a slow, deliberate procession. Drills, pumps, reinforcement rigs. The road groaned under the weight. Switchbacks widened to accommodate equipment that had no business being there. Weeks turned into months. The man watched from a distance, his role reduced to witness. He spoke with engineers when they came down for supplies or reports, absorbing fragments of a story that had never been meant for him. Project Hollow had been a response to a known fault line, a last-minute attempt to stabilize a ridge above a growing valley. It worked, barely, but funding shifted. Priorities changed. The project was mothballed, sealed, and quietly forgotten. Except by one man. Someone maintained it. One engineer sat over coffee in a diner that smelled like grease and old hope. For years, valves adjusted, minor repairs, pressure balanced just enough to hold. The man stared into his cup. "My grandfather," he said. The engineer nodded. "Looks that way." He wasn't an engineer, but he learned. Probably trained by the original crew. Stayed behind when everyone else left. The weight of it settled into the man's chest with a dull ache. All those years of silence. The absence. The refusal to explain. It hadn't been neglect. It had been duty. He imagined the old man alone in that cabin, listening to the mountain the way some people listen to the sea, making adjustments no one would ever see, carrying a secret that could have emptied the valley if mishandled. No wonder he'd never come down. Pressure was released slowly, carefully, through new vents drilled deeper into stone. The chamber was reinforced with modern materials, layers of steel and concrete thicker than anything built in the last century. Systems were installed to monitor the ridge long after the crews would leave. The mountain was given a future it had nearly been denied. When the work was finally done, the engineer found him where he waited, always within sight of the ridge. "It's stable," she said. "As stable as geology ever gets. Whatever your grandfather prevented back then, you prevented it again." The words landed heavier than praise. He was cleared to return a week later. The drive up felt different now. Familiar, but charged with memory. The mountain hadn't changed its shape, but his understanding of it had shifted irrevocably. The cabin stood where he'd left it, quiet and whole. Inside, the wall had been rebuilt, reinforced, sealed. Behind it lay steel and concrete, and the final resting place of a secret too dangerous to display. That night, he sat on the porch, his dog stretched at his feet, the fire inside casting a warm glow through the windows. The forest breathed its ordinary sounds. Wind in branches, water over stone. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt earned. And somewhere deep beneath the mountain, the pressure slept again. The cabin greeted him the way it always had, without ceremony, without judgment. It stood quiet in the clearing, roof straightened where it had once sagged, porch boards replaced, but still left unpolished, honest in their newness. The mountain wrapped around it in familiar silence, the trees breathing softly as the wind moved through their needles. Nothing announced his return. Nothing resisted it. That felt right. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled of wood smoke and cold stone, clean and grounded. The rebuilt walls stood smooth and unremarkable, its surface no different from the rest of the room. No seam, no hint of iron or concrete, or what lay sealed behind it. Beyond that wall, the hidden chamber no longer existed as a possibility. Steel and reinforced fill had erased it completely, welded and poured and locked into the mountain with a finality that left no room for curiosity. The engineers had been clear. There would be no access, no reopening, no temptation. Some doors, once closed, were meant to stay that way. Life settled, not dramatically, not all at once. It found its rhythm in small, repeatable acts. Checking the roof after snowfall, splitting wood in the mornings, walking the ridgeline trail with his dog as the sun climbed and shadows retreated, fixing what broke before it had time to become a problem. The silence that had once felt sharp softened into something restorative. It no longer pressed against him. It made room. At night, he slept deeply. No restless counting of hours. No listening for other people's movements through shared walls. The mountain held its own sounds now. Branches shifting, snow sliding from rock, the distant call of something moving unseen through trees. His dog changed too. The restless pacing faded. The low, unconscious tension in his shoulders eased. He spent long hours stretched near the hearth or on the porch, eyes closed, breathing slow and even. Whatever scent had unsettled him before was gone, sealed beneath layers of stone and steel. Instincts satisfied at last. Sometimes, the man found himself thinking of his grandfather without the old irritation or confusion. The memories he'd lacked had been replaced by understanding. A man who chose responsibility over recognition, who carried a burden in silence because explaining it would have required trust in a world that rarely listened. Legacy, he realized, wasn't about what was left behind. It was about what never happened because someone stood watch. The cabin no longer felt borrowed. It no longer felt like something he was waiting to be asked to leave. Every repair he made, every board he replaced, every quiet evening he spent listening to the mountain knit him more firmly into the place. He belonged here not because his name was on a deed, but because he had answered when the place asked something of him. One evening, as dusk bled slowly into the trees, he sat on the porch with a mug cooling in his hands. The sky burned briefly with color before settling into the muted blues and grays of night. His dog lay at his feet, chin on paws, eyes half-lidded. The mountain breathed. Not literally, of course, but it felt that way. Stable, present, no longer holding tension behind a hidden wall. Just existing, massive and indifferent and safe. He understood then that some inheritances were not gifts. They were warnings. They were tests of attention, of patience, of whether a person would choose to listen when something felt wrong instead of walking away. He had listened, and because of that, nothing else had to happen. No collapse, no loss, no names etched into stone for a disaster that had been narrowly avoided and quickly forgotten. That, too, was a kind of success. He scratched his dog behind the ears, earning a slow thump of a tail against the porch boards. The simple sound felt like punctuation at the end of a long sentence. Inside, the fire crackled softly. Outside, the mountain stood untroubled. Between the two, the cabin held steady, no longer waiting. Some secrets aren't meant to be owned. They're meant to be carried responsibly. If this story moved you, reminded you of hidden burdens, or made you think about what we owe the places and people before us, like, comment, and subscribe to the Hidden Treasure Stories. Every story hides something worth discovering. Stay curious, stay kind, and don't ignore the walls that feel wrong.